The chandeliers of Ashworth House blazed with the fire of 1,000 candles, their crystalline tears casting fractured rainbows across silk-papered walls and the upturned faces of London's most distinguished liars. It was the height of the season, that peculiar ritual wherein fortunes were displayed like peacock feathers and daughters were paraded like prized mares at auction, and Lady Ashworth's ball represented the apex of this glittering brutality, an evening where reputations could be made with a single dance or destroyed with a whispered word behind a painted fan. The air hung thick with beeswax and bergamot, with the cloying sweetness of hothouse roses forced into bloom before their time, with the sharp undercurrent of desperation that no amount of French perfume could quite disguise. Couples turned in endless circles upon the polished floor, their movements as precisely choreographed as any theatrical production, while along the gilded margins of the room, mammas with calculating eyes assessed the shifting landscape of eligible connections, and young ladies practiced the art of appearing simultaneously available and unattainable. This was the battlefield of the ton, and every smile concealed a weapon, every compliment a careful stratagem in the endless war for position and prosperity. Yet, for all the studied gaiety, for all the champagne flowing like the Thames and the orchestra playing as though their very lives depended upon maintaining the illusion of effortless joy, a current of unease rippled beneath the surface this evening, a name passing from powdered ear to powdered ear, spoken in hushed tones that somehow carried farther than any shout. Asterisk, the devil Duke. Asterisk, they said he had been seen in London, his black carriage spotted on Mayfair's pristine streets, and the very possibility of his presence cast a shadow across Lady Ashworth's carefully constructed paradise. Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Thornfield, had not graced a society function in 3 years, not since the scandal, not since his wife, not since the whispers had calcified into accepted truth, and yet word had spread that he might appear tonight, that some dark purpose had drawn him from his self-imposed exile in the northern wilds. "They say he killed Lord Pemberton in that duel," murmured Lady Whitmore to her companion, her fan beating a nervous rhythm against her ample bosom, shot him through the heart, without a moment's hesitation, and smiled as he fell. Her companion, a widow of considerable experience in the art of gossip, leaned closer with the eager hunger of one about to contribute a particularly choice morsel. "And his wife, his first wife, found at the bottom of that tower, and not a servant who would speak of what they saw." The whispers multiplied and transformed as they travelled, growing more monstrous with each retelling, until the man they described seemed less human than legend, less mortal than myth, a creature of darkness, who had somehow claimed a duke's coronet and all the terrible power that accompanied it. Mothers drew their daughters closer, gentlemen checked their cravats and wondered if they had ever, in some forgotten slight, given offence to the Blackwood name. The Devil Duke had not yet arrived at Ashworth House, but his shadow had preceded him, and in the flickering candlelight it seemed to grow longer with each passing moment, stretching across the ballroom floor like a promise of chaos yet to come. At the furthest edge of the ballroom, where the candlelight grew thin and the gilt-framed mirrors reflected only shadows, Lady Rosalind Wren stood alone beside a marble column and watched the glittering performance of the ton with the detached fascination of a naturalist observing some particularly garish species of tropical bird. She was 24 years old, ancient by the marriage market's brutal arithmetic, and she had long since ceased to expect that any gentleman's gaze would linger upon her unremarkable brown hair, her unfashionably direct grey eyes, or the gown she had worn to 3 previous seasons, because her father's creditors had proven more pressing than Modesti's bills. Asterisk, the shelf, asterisk they called it, that purgatory where unwed women past their prime were consigned to gather dust, and Rosalind had made her peace with its splinters and shadows, had learned to find a certain bitter freedom in being overlooked, for invisibility, however painful, at least spared one the indignity of false hope. She watched Lady Catherine Pemberton, 17, golden, dowered with £40,000 except her 4th dance of the evening, while eager suitors circled like well-dressed sharks, and Rosalind felt not envy but something closer to exhausted amusement at the elaborate theatre of it all, the way these young creatures performed desire and modesty in equal measure, never understanding that the game was rigged from the start, that the winners were determined by ledger books and land holdings long before the first quadrille began. Her mother, God rest her gentle soul, had tried to prepare her for this world, had whispered advice about lowering her eyes and softening her opinions and making herself small enough to fit into whatever space a husband might permit her to occupy. Asterisk, be invisible, my darling, and you will be safe. Asterisk. But her mother had also died, worn thin by her own invisibility, by years of fading into wallpaper, while her husband gambled away their future, and Rosalind had learned a different lesson from that quiet diminishment, had learned that safety purchased through erasure was no safety at all but merely a slower form of death. So she stood at the margins and she watched with her two sharp eyes, cataloguing the hypocrisies and cruelties that passed for civilization among England's finest families. The way Lord Ashworth's hand lingered too long on servants' shoulders, the way Lady Whitmore's diamonds could not disguise the bruises beneath her powder, the way young men spoke of honour, while conducting themselves with none. And if her observations would never earn her a husband or a household, at least they were her own, uncompromised by the desperate pretense that any of this was beautiful rather than simply brutal. When the whispers about the Devil Duke rippled through the crowd, Rosalind noted how quickly fear displaced boredom on those carefully painted faces, how the very name Blackwood seemed to summon something primal beneath the veneer of sophistication, and she found herself curious despite her determined disengagement, curious about what manner of man could command such universal terror, curious whether the monster of rumour bore any resemblance to the mortal who had earned the title, and curious, most of all, why the prospect of his arrival made her feel not frightened but strangely, inexplicably awake for the first time all evening. The doors of the ballroom opened without announcement, without the customary herald's call that ought to precede a duke's arrival, and yet every soul in attendance knew the precise moment. Sebastian Blackwood crossed the threshold, knew it by the sudden hush that descended like winter's first frost, by the way conversations died mid-syllable and dancers faltered in their steps, by the collective intake of breath that seemed to steal all the air from that glittering chamber and leave nothing but the acrid taste of fear upon the tongue. Rosalind turned toward the entrance with the rest of them, expecting she knew not what, precisely some Gothic spectre, perhaps, some creature of midnight and malevolence that would justify the terror she had witnessed spreading through the ton like plague, and what she saw instead was simply a man, though the word seemed inadequate for the figure who stood framed in the doorway like a portrait of beautiful desolation. He was tall, broad of shoulder, dressed in unrelieved black that made the peacock colours of other gentlemen seem garish and absurd, and his face, his face was the landscape of some terrible story, handsome in the way of ruined cathedrals and storm-wrecked coastlines, all sharp angles and shadowed hollows dominated by a scar that traced a pale lightning bolt from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a permanent reminder of violence survived if not escaped. His hair was dark as a moonless night, swept back from features that might have graced a Renaissance painting of Lucifer before the fall, and his eyes, even from across the ballroom, Rosalind could see that they were the grey of December skies, the grey of ashened endings, and they surveyed the assembled company with an expression of such profound indifference that it bordered upon contempt. The whispers resumed almost immediately, louder now with the confidence of numbers, a chorus of condemnation that the Duke surely heard and equally surely chose to ignore as he moved into the room with the unhurried gait of a predator who knows that nothing present poses any threat worthy of haste. Asterisk, 3 families destroyed. Asterisk, hissed someone to Rosalind's left. Asterisk, ruined utterly when they dared to cross him. Asterisk, and from her right, asterisk, his first wife, barely cold before he ceased his mourning, heartless creature, and them saying she fell, but everyone knowing that towers don't claim women who wish to live. Asterisk, Rosalind watched him accept a glass of champagne from a trembling footman, watched the crowd part before him like the Red Sea before Moses, watched how even the boldest gentleman avoided his gaze, and the most brazen ladies suddenly discovered urgent need of the retiring room, and she saw what no one else seemed capable of seeing. Perhaps because no one else was looking for anything other than confirmation of the monster they had already decided he must be. Behind the cold mask, behind the scar and the reputation and the terrible weight of the Blackwood name, the Devil Duke's eyes held something that Rosalind recognized with the immediate, bone-deep certainty of one sufferer identifying another. Exhaustion, the kind that no amount of sleep could cure, the kind that came from carrying burdens too heavy for human shoulders across distances too vast for human endurance, the kind that she saw every morning in her own mirror and had learned to hide behind sharp wit and sharper observations. Asterisk, he is tired, asterisk, she thought, and the realization settled into her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. Asterisk, he is so desperately, devastatingly tired, and not a single person in this room, full of hundreds, has bothered to notice. Asterisk. 3 days after the Ashworth ball, Rosalind sat in the morning room of their modest townhouse, modest being the generous term for a residence whose wallpaper peeled in the corners and whose fires were lit only in rooms currently occupied when her father summoned her to his study with the particular tone of voice that had presaged every catastrophe of her adult life, from her mother's final illness to the dismissal of their last remaining servants, and she rose from her needlework with the calm resignation of one who has learned that dreading disaster does nothing to prevent its arrival. Viscount Wren had aged a decade in the past year alone, his once proud bearing now stooped beneath the weight of debts he could neither pay nor escape, and when Rosalind entered the dim study with its smell of old paper and older regrets, she found him standing at the window with his back to her, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes, as he delivered the final blow to whatever remained of her hopes for an ordinary life. "The estate will be seized within the month," he said, and his voice cracked on the words like ice too thin to bear the weight placed upon it. "Everything, the house in Kent, the London property, your mother's jewellery that I swore I would never touch, all of it, gone to satisfy creditors who have grown tired of my promises and my excuses and my endless, futile attempts to salvage something from the wreckage I have made of this family's fortunes." Rosalind absorbed this news with the peculiar numbness that had become her constant companion, thinking of her younger sisters who still believed marriage might save them, of her mother's grave in the Kent churchyard that would soon belong to strangers, of the decades of Wren history that would be auctioned off to pay for her father's weakness. And then he turned to face her at last, and she saw something worse than despair in his rheumy eyes. She saw hope, the terrible hope of a drowning man who has spotted a piece of floating wreckage and does not care what he must sacrifice to reach it. "There is an offer," he continued, and each word seemed to cost him what little dignity remained. "From the Duke of Thornfield, the one they call the Devil Duke, he has offered to pay every debt, to restore our family completely, in exchange for—" He could not finish, but he did not need to. Rosalind understood with sudden crystalline clarity why she had been chosen, why a man infamous for his monstrous reputation would want a bride with nothing to recommend her but her desperate circumstances. She was perfect precisely because she was worthless, because no woman with options would accept such an arrangement, because her invisibility to every other suitor made her invisible to hope itself, and therefore safe to wed without expectation, safe to install in some distant estate where she would ask no questions and make no demands, and fade into the wallpaper just as her mother had always counseled. Asterisk, dignity or survival. Asterisk, she thought, staring at her father's trembling hands. Asterisk, my pride or my sister's futures, my autonomy or my family's name times, and the choice was no choice at all, had never been a choice, because she had been raised to understand that women like her did not get to choose, only to endure whatever choices were made for them by men with money and men with debts, and men who never once considered what it cost to be the currency in which their bargains were paid. The Duke of Thornfield arrived at precisely 3 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon that seemed determined to match his reputation, the sky hanging low and grey over London like a burial shroud, and Rosalind received him in her father's study, with her hands folded and her spine straight and her heart beating, a rhythm of terrified defiance that she refused to let reach her face. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing. Her fear would not perform the trembling maiden role that society had scripted for this grotesque theatre, and when he entered the room in his perpetual mourning black with that scar catching the dim light like an accusation, she met his winter-grey eyes without flinching and saw something flicker there, something that might have been surprise at finding prey that did not immediately cower. "Lady Rosalind," he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, rougher, like stones tumbling in deep water. "I trust your father has explained the terms of my offer." She inclined her head, a gesture that acknowledged without submitting, and replied with a steadiness that seemed to unsettle him more than hysteria would have. "He has, Your Grace. You wish to purchase a wife who will ask nothing of you, expect nothing from you, and fade conveniently into whatever corner of your existence you designate for her accommodation, in exchange for which my family will be saved from ruin, and I will be elevated to a position of theoretical prestige and practical imprisonment." The silence that followed her words stretched taut as a bowstring, and she watched his jaw tighten, watched his gloved hands flex once at his sides, watched the mask of cold indifference struggle to maintain its hold against what she suspected was the novel experience of being spoken to as something other than a monster or a meal ticket. "You have a peculiar way of accepting proposals," he said finally, and there was an edge to his voice now. Not quite anger, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested she had wandered into territory he had not prepared for. "I have not yet accepted," Rosalind replied, and she saw his eyes narrow with something that was definitely surprise now, possibly even the faintest ghost of respect. "I have one condition, and it is not negotiable. I will marry you, Your Grace. I will live in your house and bear your name and ask no questions about your past or your heart, or whatever demons drive you to seek a wife you need not love. But I will not be treated as invisible. I will not be relegated to silence and shadows and the slow death of being unseen, because I have spent 24 years being overlooked and dismissed and treated as furniture with a pulse, and I find I have no more tolerance for it." He stared at her for a long moment, this woman who should have been weeping with gratitude or shrinking with terror, and Rosalind stared back, and something shifted in the air between them. Not warmth, not yet, but the first hairline fracture in a wall that had stood unbreached for years, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its razor edge. "You are not what I expected, Lady Rosalind." She allowed herself the smallest smile, sharp as a blade's edge. "No, Your Grace, I suspect I am not." The wedding took place on a morning that seemed to have forgotten the existence of sunlight, in a chapel so small and so empty that their voices echoed off the stone walls like ghosts, mocking the pretense of celebration, and Rosalind spoke her vows with a steady voice, while rain streaked the ancient windows, and Sebastian stood beside her in his eternal black, his responses clipped and mechanical, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder, as though he could not bear to witness what he was doing or perhaps what he was purchasing. There were no flowers, no music, no guests beyond her father, who wept silent tears of relief that looked obscenely like gratitude, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian did not kiss her, merely offered his arm with the formal courtesy one might extend to a stranger at a dinner party, and Rosalind took it with matching formality, thinking, "Times, this is how it begins." Then, not with passion or even hope, but with two people performing a transaction and calling it matrimony asterisk. The carriage ride to Thornfield Hall took 3 days, during which the rain never ceased, and Sebastian spoke perhaps a dozen sentences, most of them regarding the comfort of the inns where they stopped or the progress of their journey, and Rosalind watched the countryside transform from London's grey sprawl to rolling green hills to increasingly wild moorland, feeling with each mile that she was travelling not merely to a new home, but to another world entirely, one where the rules she had learned no longer applied, and the future stretched before her, as unknowable as her husband's shuttered face. When Thornfield finally emerged from the mist on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Rosalind caught her breath at the sight of it, magnificent and melancholy in equal measure, a sprawling estate of grey stone and climbing ivy that seemed to have grown organically from the moorland itself, its windows dark despite the hour, its gardens overgrown with a wildness that spoke of years of neglect, beautiful, the way a widow is beautiful, draped in the memory of happiness long since departed. The staff assembled in the entrance hall to greet them a skeleton crew, she noted, for an estate this size, and their faces when they saw her ranged from poorly concealed shock to something approaching wonder, as though the Duke had arrived with a unicorn rather than a wife, and the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, actually whispered mercy under her breath before remembering herself and dropping into a curtsy. Sebastian introduced her with the minimum words required. "This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield. See that she has everything she requires." And then he turned and walked away down a corridor that swallowed him into shadow, leaving Rosalind standing in the vast entrance hall of her new home, with rain still dripping from her travelling cloak, and the certain knowledge that she had just been delivered to her cage, however gilded, and that the man who had locked her in it had no intention of keeping her company within its bars. Weeks passed in the strange, suspended animation of a life half-lived, and Rosalind found herself mapping the corridors of Thornfield Hall the way a cartographer might chart unknown territory, discovering its secrets room by room, shadow by shadow, learning which floorboards creaked and which windows caught the morning light and which doors remained forever locked against her curiosity. She learned, too, the rhythms of her ghost of a husband, how he emerged from his study precisely at 8 for dinners they shared in silence, broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain, how he never looked at her directly but she sometimes caught him watching from the corner of her vision, how he retired immediately afterward to whatever solitary pursuits occupied the hours between dusk and the dawn. She suspected he rarely slept to see. Mrs. Crane proved an unexpected ally in those early weeks, her initial wariness thawing degree by degree, as Rosalind demonstrated that she was neither the weeping, fragile creature the housekeeper had feared, nor the grasping social climber she might have expected, and over cups of tea in the kitchen that would have scandalized London society, the older woman began to share fragments of Thornfield's history, the balls that had once filled these halls with music, the gardens that had been the late Duchess's pride, the master who had smiled, once, before grief had carved him into the stone figure he had become. It was the gardens that called most strongly to Rosalind, those overgrown tangles of what had once been cultivated beauty, roses strangled by weeds and pathways lost beneath years of neglect, and she began spending her mornings there with borrowed gloves and an old pair of shears, cutting back the wilderness inch by inch, feeling in the work a satisfaction that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with reclaiming something times anything times as her own. Small rebellions followed, each one a stone dropped into the still waters of Thornfield's stagnant existence. She ordered the curtains in the morning room, pulled back and forbade the footman from closing them again. She placed fresh flowers from her salvaged garden on the dining table each evening. She had the dust covers removed from the pianoforte in the music room and played in the afternoons, simple melodies that wound through the empty corridors like prayers. Sebastian noticed she knew he did, could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw when he encountered some new evidence of her campaign against the darkness he seemed determined to preserve, could feel his attention tracking her movements, even when he refused to acknowledge her existence with anything more than the minimum courtesies their arrangement required. But he said nothing, and his silence felt less like indifference now, and more like a held breath, like a man watching a lit fuse burn towards something he could not quite bring himself to extinguish. It was on a night when sleep had proven as elusive as her husband's regard that Rosalind found herself wandering the corridors of Thornfield in the small hours, her candle casting trembling shadows on walls that seemed to breathe with secrets, and it was chance alone, or perhaps something more like fate, that led her past the library door and caused her to pause at the thin ribbon of golden light that escaped from beneath it, for she had assumed Sebastian to be long abed, or else locked away in his study with whatever demons kept him company, through the darkness. The door stood slightly ajar, and through that sliver of opening she could see him seated in a wing-back chair before the dying fire, a book open in his hands, and what stopped her breath in her throat was not merely the unexpectedness of finding him there, but the transformation that solitude had wrought upon his features. Gone was the mask of cold indifference he wore like armor, gone the sardonic curl of lip and the eyes that looked through people rather than at them, and in their place was something so raw and unguarded that Rosalind felt she had stumbled upon a man in the midst of prayer, or grief, or some private communion too sacred for witnesses. He was reading aloud, she realized, his voice barely above a murmur, and though she could not make out every word, she caught fragments that she recognized as verse asterisk, "She walks in beauty, like the night, asterisk," and the way he spoke the lines was not performative but intimate, as though the poetry were a letter written to him alone, as though each word cost him something precious to speak. His face in the firelight was younger than she had ever seen it, stripped of the weariness and the bitter self-protection, and she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that this was not the face of a monster, but of a man who had been wounded so deeply that he had forgotten any other way to exist. She saw grief there. Yes, but also a loneliness so profound it seemed to have carved itself into the very bones of him, and something in her own chest, some wall she had not even known she had built, began to crack and crumble at the sight of it. She retreated without making a sound, pressing herself against the corridor wall as her candle flickered and her heart performed strange acrobatics behind her ribs, and she did not return to the library door, though part of her ached to push it open and demand to know who he truly was, beneath all the rumors and reputation times. Not yet, asterisk, she told herself. Asterisk, he is not ready, and perhaps neither am I, asterisk. When she finally found her way back to her chambers and drew aside the heavy curtains to look out at the moor, she discovered that the rain had stopped for the first time since her arrival at Thornfield, and the clouds were beginning to part to reveal a scatter of stars so bright they seemed like promises, and Rosalind stood at the window until dawn began to pink the horizon, thinking of poetry and firelight and the expression on a devil's face when he believed himself utterly alone. The village of Thornfield lay some 2 miles distant from the great house, a cluster of stone cottages and modest shops gathered around a church whose steeple had watched over these moors for 300 years, and it was on a crisp morning, when the sky hung pale and promising above the heather, that Rosalind ordered the small carriage brought round, determined to venture beyond the estate's iron gates and discover what manner of world existed in the shadow of her husband's fearsome reputation. She expected coldness. She realized as the carriage wound down the rutted lane, expected the villagers to regard her with the same wary distance that London society had always shown. The devil Duke expected perhaps even hostility toward the woman who had bound herself to their local monster, and she steeled herself accordingly, smoothing her gloves and arranging her features into the pleasant neutrality that had served her through so many social battlefields. What she found instead was something that unraveled every assumption she had carried with her from London, like so much useless baggage. The shopkeeper's wife curtsied warmly and pressed a jar of preserved plums into her hands as a wedding gift. The elderly vicar spoke of his Grace's generosity toward the church restoration, with tears threatening at the corners of his rheumy eyes, and when Rosalind paused to admire the tidy schoolhouse with its freshly painted shutters and the sound of children's voices reciting their letters within, the schoolmistress, a young widow named Mrs. Pemberton, emerged to grasp her hands and explain that the school existed only because the Duke had funded its construction and continued to pay her salary, asking nothing in return except that the children of Thornfield village receive the education that poverty would otherwise have denied them. "He saved my Thomas," the blacksmith's wife told her over the counter of the village's single shop, her voice low with the reverence usually reserved for saints and saviors, and the story that emerged was one of a young man drowning in his father's debts, facing debtor's prison and the destruction of his family, until the Duke had quietly paid every creditor and asked only that Thomas continue his father's trade, never told a soul. His Grace didn't, made Thomas swear to keep it secret. But we all know, and there's not a family in this village that hasn't felt his kindness one way or another, though he'd sooner die than admit to any of it. Rosalind walked back to her waiting carriage in something of a daze, her mind turning over these revelations like stones in a riverbed, each one smoothed by the current of truth into something that bore no resemblance to the jagged rocks of reputation that London had built into a wall around Sebastian Blackwood. Times the monster pays for widows' pensions, the devil funds schools for poor children, the man they whisper about in ballrooms has saved more souls in this tiny village than all the charitable societies of the ton combined, and he has hidden every kindness behind a mask of cruelty as though goodness were something to be ashamed of. Times, and as Thornfield Hall came into view, its windows catching the afternoon light like eyes finally opening after a long sleep, Rosalind felt the questions multiplying within her chest, demanding answers she suspected her husband had never intended to give. She found him in his study that evening, standing before the tall windows that looked out upon the moor, his back to the door and his hands clasped behind him in that posture of rigid control she had come to recognize as his armor against the world, and when she entered without knocking a small rebellion she had cultivated over these weeks. He did not turn, though she saw the slight stiffening of his shoulders that told her he knew precisely who had intruded upon his solitude. "I visited the village today," she said without preamble, and something in her tone must have warned him that this would not be their usual dance of careful politeness and strategic silence, for he turned at last to face her, his expression arranging itself into the familiar mask of cold indifference, even as his eyes betrayed a flicker of something that might have been apprehension. "Indeed," he replied, the single word flat as a stone dropped into still water, and Rosalind felt a surge of something between frustration and admiration. frustration at his relentless commitment to this performance of villainy, admiration at the sheer stubborn dedication it must require to be so thoroughly misunderstood by choice. "They told me interesting things," she continued, stepping further into the room, refusing to be intimidated by the way he drew himself up to his full, formidable height, about schools and widows' pensions and a blacksmith's son saved from debtor's prison, about a duke who hides his kindnesses like other men hide their sins. And she saw the moment her words struck home, saw the mask crack just slightly before rage rushed in to seal the breach, and when he spoke his voice was winter itself, cold enough to burn. "You will cease this investigation into matters that do not concern you," he said, each word precise as a blade. "I did not marry you to serve as my confessor or my chronicler, and whatever foolish gossip the villagers have fed you, I suggest you forget it immediately." But Rosalind had spent too many years being silenced, too many years, making herself small and invisible, to appease those who found her very existence inconvenient, and something in her had fundamentally shifted during those quiet weeks at Thornfield. She had found her voice in the spaces he had left empty, had discovered her own strength in the garden. She was coaxing back to life, and she would not surrender it now simply because he wrapped his fear in fury and called it authority. "I am not afraid of you," she said, and her voice did not waver, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I think perhaps no one has ever truly been afraid of you, your grace, and that is precisely the problem. You have worn this mask so long you have forgotten it is a mask. You have played the monster so convincingly that you have lost yourself inside the role, and I find I am not interested in being married to a fiction when the truth is so much more compelling." His face went white, then red, and for a moment she thought he might shout, might finally unleash whatever tempest lived behind those storm-grey eyes. But instead, he simply turned and walked past her, out of the study and into the darkening corridor, and the sound of his boots on the marble floor echoed like a retreat from a battlefield he had not expected to lose. Rosalind stood alone in the gathering shadows, trembling with the aftermath of her own courage, knowing she had wounded something deep within him, and uncertain whether she had begun a healing or merely opened an older wound. The days that followed were marked by Sebastian's conspicuous absence, a withdrawal so complete that Rosalind might have believed herself a widow rather than a wife. He took his meals in his study, rode out before dawn and returned after dark, and on the rare occasions when their paths crossed in the corridors of Thornfield Hall, he looked through her as though she had become the ghost, and he the living, and this studied avoidance told her more clearly than any words that her confrontation had struck true, had found some tender place beneath the armor he wore like a second skin, and she found herself caught between the urge to pursue and the wisdom to wait, uncertain which path might lead toward healing and which toward further harm. It was Mrs. Crane who finally broke the silence, appearing at Rosalind's elbow one grey afternoon as she stood in the restored garden, contemplating the bare branches that would, come spring, burst forth with the roses she had coaxed back from near death, and the housekeeper's weathered face bore an expression of such grave deliberation that Rosalind knew before a word was spoken that something significant was about to be revealed. "You'll be wondering about the first Duchess, Mrs. Crane said without preamble, her voice low as though the very walls might carry tales. "About Lady Eleanor, and what happened to her, because you cannot understand him without understanding that, and I think," she paused, seeming to weigh her loyalty against some greater need, "I think perhaps it's time someone told you the truth, rather than leaving you to piece together the lies that society has spread like poison across every drawing-room in England." The story that emerged over the next hour, told in Mrs. Crane's halting voice as the autumn wind stirred the dying leaves around them, was not the tale of murder that London whispered. It was something far more terrible in its ordinariness, far more tragic in its helplessness. Eleanor had been beautiful and fragile, a creature of light and shadow whose mind had never been quite anchored to the world the rest of them inhabited, and Sebastian had loved her with the desperate devotion of a man trying to hold water in his cupped hands, watching it slip through his fingers, no matter how tightly he pressed them together. He brought physicians from London, from Paris, from Vienna, Mrs. Crane continued, her eyes distant with memory. He sat with her through the dark nights, when she saw things that weren't there. He held her when she wept, for reasons she couldn't name, and when she finally, The housekeeper's voice broke, and Rosalind felt her own throat tighten with sympathetic grief. When she finally walked into the lake, on a morning much like this one, grey and cold and quiet, he was the one who found her, who carried her back to the house in his arms, who closed her eyes, and then closed his own heart, because he believed he had failed her, believed that if he had only loved her better, watched her more closely, been somehow more than mortal, he might have saved her. Rosalind stood motionless as the weight of this revelation settled upon her shoulders, understanding at last the geography of Sebastian's isolation times. He did not become a monster because he destroyed his wife. He became a monster because society needed someone to blame for a tragedy that had no villain. And he accepted their hatred because it matched his own, because somewhere in the depths of his grief-ravaged heart he believed he deserved it. Times, and something within her that had been merely curious, transformed into something fiercer, something protective, something that felt dangerously like the first stirrings of love. As autumn arrived at Thornfield, painting the moors in shades of amber and rust, Rosalind made a decision that would prove more powerful than any confrontation. She chose simply to remain, to be present without demanding, to offer steadiness rather than siege. And in this quiet campaign, she discovered a weapon against which Sebastian's carefully constructed walls had no defense, for he had built them to withstand assault, not patience, had armored himself against anger and accusation and fear, but found himself utterly unprepared for a woman who asked nothing of him except that he allow her to exist in his orbit, who filled the spaces of his empty house with warmth, and waited, endlessly waited, for him to decide whether he wished to step into the light she created or remain forever in shadow. The change came not in grand gestures, but in moments so small they might have been overlooked by anyone not watching with the careful attention Rosalind had cultivated. First, he began appearing at tea without being summoned, settling into the chair across from hers with a book he rarely read, his eyes straying toward her over the pages as though she were the more compelling text. Then came the evening when she sat puzzling over the chessboard. Mrs. Crane had unearthed from some forgotten cupboard, and he paused in the doorway, watching her contemplate a doomed strategy before saying, almost against his will, "Your knight is poorly positioned," and when she looked up with raised brows and a challenge in her eyes, he crossed the room and sank into the opposite chair and proceeded to dismantle her defenses with a ruthless efficiency that left her laughing at her own defeat, and the sound of her laughter seemed to startle him, as though he had forgotten such sounds could exist within these walls, and for just a moment, a heartbeat, no more the corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. The garden, too, marked their progress in its own silent language. Rosalind had labored through the dying summer and into the cooling autumn, clearing years of neglect, coaxing dormant roots back to life with patience and determination that matched her approach to her husband, and against all reason, against every expectation of the season. A single rose bush near the south wall burst into bloom, its crimson flowers defiant against the October chill, and when Sebastian found her there one morning, her hands dirty with soil and her face flushed with triumph, as she cradled one perfect blossom, he stood watching her for a long moment before speaking words that cost him more than she could know. "You have brought this place back to life," he said, and his voice held something raw beneath its careful neutrality, something that suggested he was not speaking only of gardens, and Rosalind looked up at him with earth beneath her fingernails and hope blooming wild in her chest, and simply smiled, asking nothing, offering everything, and somewhere in the distance the clouds parted and sunlight spilled across the moor like a promise. The evening that changed everything between them arrived without fanfare or warning, settling over Thornfield Hall with the quiet inevitability of snowfall, and Rosalind found herself curled in the chair beside the library fire with a book she had long since stopped pretending to read, her thoughts wandering through the labyrinth of the past weeks, when Sebastian appeared in the doorway, not retreating this time, not passing through on his way to somewhere she was not, but pausing there as though gathering courage before crossing to take the chair opposite hers, and for a long while they simply sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling its ancient language between them, until Rosalind heard herself speaking words she had never intended to share, words that rose from some deep well of accumulated solitude. "My mother told me, when I was 15 and already too plain and too sharp-tongued to attract the suitors my family needed, that my only hope was to become invisible, to take up no space, make no demands, exist so quietly that perhaps some man might overlook my deficiencies long enough to marry me out of convenience, and I tried. Her voice caught on something that might have been grief or might have been old anger, finally finding its way to air. I tried for years to make myself small, to swallow my thoughts before they could escape my lips, to want nothing, because wanting was the province of girls who had something to offer. And when she died, I promised myself I would stop trying, but the habit of invisibility. She looked up to find Sebastian watching her with an intensity that made her breath falter. The habit became a kind of armor, and I told myself it was protection when really it was just a slower kind of death. The silence that followed her confession felt different from the silences that had characterized their marriage, charged with something fragile and newly born. And when Sebastian finally spoke, his voice emerged rough-edged, as though the words had to fight their way past years of disuse. "I thought invisibility would protect me too," he said, and his eyes held hers with a vulnerability she had never seen there before. "After Eleanor, after the whispers and the accusations, and the way society looked at me, as though I were something to be feared rather than pitied, I cultivated the monster they wanted to see because it kept them at a distance, because if they were frightened they would not come close enough to see the truth, and if they could not see the truth, they could not use it against me. But you are right. What you said that day when I tried to drive you away, you were right." He leaned forward slightly, firelight playing across the scar that bisected his cheek, softening it somehow. "No one has been unafraid of me in so long that I forgot what it felt like to be truly seen, and I told myself the loneliness was the price of safety, when really it was just—" He paused, and she watched him struggle with the confession. "It was just loneliness, preserved and protected and utterly unchanged by all my walls. And you," his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, "you have made me remember that being seen might be worth the risk of being wounded." The letter arrived on a morning when frost had painted the windows of Thornfield Hall in delicate crystalline patterns, and Rosalind watched Sebastian's face transform as he read it, watched the openness that had begun to characterize their evenings, together retreat behind the familiar mask of cold indifference, and she knew before he spoke that the outside world had finally intruded upon the fragile sanctuary they had been building together in this isolated corner of England. "Lady Ashworth requests our presence at her winter ball," he said, his voice flat as he set the letter aside, with the careful precision of a man handling something poisonous. "Society, it seems, has grown curious about the Devil Duke's new bride. They wish to inspect you, to measure whether you have been sufficiently broken by your proximity to a monster, and when they find you whole and unharmed, they will invent new cruelties to explain it." And there was such weariness in his words, such bone-deep exhaustion at the prospect of returning to the arena where his reputation had been forged in whispers and accusations, that Rosalind felt her heart constrict with an emotion she was not yet ready to name. She rose from her chair and crossed to where he stood by the window, close enough to touch but not touching, and she saw the tension coiled in his shoulders, the rigid line of his jaw, and she understood that he was preparing to refuse to retreat once more behind the walls of Thornfield and let the ton believe whatever they wished, rather than subject either of them to their venomous scrutiny. "We should go," she said, and his head turned sharply toward her, disbelief evident in every line of his face. "They will whisper regardless, Sebastian, whether we attend or hide away. Their tongues will wag with speculation and invention, and I find I have grown rather tired of allowing others to write the narrative of my life." She met his eyes steadily, drawing on the courage she had discovered somewhere in the quiet months of their marriage. "Let them see us together. Let them see that we cannot be wounded by their petty cruelties. And perhaps," she paused, choosing her words with care, "perhaps it is time the ton learned that there are some things their whispers cannot destroy." He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, wonder, perhaps, or the dawning recognition of a truth he had not expected to find in a marriage built on convenience and desperation. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, with an emotion that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "You would face them willingly, knowing what they will say, knowing how they will look at you, at us?" And Rosalind smiled, feeling the warmth of certainty spreading through her chest, feeling for the first time in her life like someone who took up space deliberately and without apology. "I would face far worse than Lady Ashworth's ballroom to stand beside you," she said, and she watched the words land, watched them pierce through armor he had spent years constructing. and in his eyes she saw something kindle, something fragile and fierce and terrifying in its intensity, and though neither of them spoke its name, they both recognized it for what it was, the first true stirring of a love neither had dared to hope for. The Ashworth ballroom blazed with the same merciless candlelight Rosalind remembered from that evening, nearly a year ago, when she had stood at its margins, invisible and resigned, watching the ton perform its elaborate rituals of cruelty. But she was not invisible now, not with Sebastian's hand resting at the small of her back as they descended the grand staircase together, not with every eye in the assembly turning toward them with barely concealed hunger for scandal, and she felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure against her skin, even as she lifted her chin and met their stares with the steady calm she had learned in the quiet halls of Thornfield. The whispers began immediately, a susurrus of malice that followed them through the crowd like wind through dead leaves. "The charity bride," she heard someone murmur, "and how long before he tires of this one?" And, "She looks well enough for a woman living with a murderer." And through it all, Sebastian remained a pillar of cold composure beside her, though she could feel the tension coiled in the muscles of his arm where her fingers rested, could sense the tremendous effort it cost him to endure the sidelong glances and theatrical shudders of ladies who drew their skirts aside as though his very proximity might contaminate them. Lady Ashworth greeted them with a smile that never reached her eyes, her welcome dripping with honeyed condescension, and the first hour passed in an exhausting parade of backhanded compliments and pointed exclusions, invitations to conversations that somehow never included Rosalind, dance partners who materialized for other ladies but never approached her, a systematic demonstration of exactly where the Devil Duke's bride ranked in society's estimation. She bore it all with grace she had not known she possessed, drawing strength from Sebastian's steady presence, from the private glances they exchanged that spoke volumes the ton could not hear until Lord Ashworth, emboldened by champagne and the appreciative titters of his sycophants, raised his voice to carry across the nearby dancers and declared with theatrical bewilderment, "I confess myself curious, Thornfield, what precisely one offers a charity case as a wedding gift, perhaps a new set of mended stockings, or the promise of regular meals." The laughter that rippled through the assembly was sharp-edged and cruel, and Rosalind felt herself shrink instinctively, felt the old habit of invisibility reaching for her. But before she could retreat, Sebastian stepped forward, and his voice, when he spoke, cut through the ballroom like a blade of ice. "One might ask, Ashworth, what gift a man offers his wife when his debts exceed his estate's value threefold, when his mistress wears jewels his lady wife believes were sold to maintain appearances, when his seat in Parliament was purchased with funds embezzled from the orphans' trust his father established. But I forget myself, for surely such questions would be indelicate in polite company." And he paused, letting the devastating silence stretch as Lord Ashworth's face drained of colour. "Suffice it to say that I gave my wife my name, my protection, and my respect, commodities which, unlike your pretensions to superiority, are not mortgaged to the point of absurdity." The ballroom had gone utterly still, and in that ringing silence Rosalind understood that something irreversible had occurred. Sebastian had chosen her, claimed her, defended her before the very society that had taught him to expect nothing but contempt, and as he turned to offer her his arm with formal courtesy, she saw in his eyes not the cold calculation of the Devil Duke, but something fierce and tender and terrifying, something that looked remarkably like love. The carriage swayed through the frozen London streets, and in the darkness, broken only by the flickering of passing lamps, Rosalind found herself trembling not from cold, though the winter night was bitter, but from the aftershocks of what had transpired in that glittering ballroom, from the memory of Sebastian's voice, cutting through the assembled aristocracy like a blade forged in righteous fury. And when she finally trusted herself to speak, her words emerged barely above a whisper. "You did not have to do that to expose yourself to their scrutiny, to make an enemy of Ashworth and all his allies. For my sake," and Sebastian, who had been staring out the frost-rimmed window as though the passing buildings held answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask, turned to face her with an expression she had never seen him wear, raw, unguarded, stripped of every careful defense he had constructed over years of isolation and accusation. "I could not bear it," he said, and his voice cracked on the words like ice breaking over deep water, "to stand there and watch them diminish you, to hear them reduce you to a charity case, a pitiful creature to be mocked you, who have shown me more courage in your quiet constancy than I have witnessed in a lifetime among so-called honorable men." And he paused, struggling visibly with emotions he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. "Eleanor, my first wife, she was not strong as you are strong, Rosalind. She was fragile in ways I did not understand until it was too late, and when the darkness took her, when she chose to leave this world, rather than remain in it. With me, I believed." His voice broke entirely, and Rosalind watched tears gather in eyes she had once thought incapable of such vulnerability. "I believed it was because I had failed her, because my love was somehow poison, because everyone who came close to me was destined to be destroyed by the proximity, and so I resolved never to let anyone close again, to make myself so monstrous that no one would wish to try, to refuse to have anyone I might lose because I could not survive another loss." The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, but neither of them noticed, suspended as they were in this moment of terrible, beautiful revelation, and Rosalind felt her own tears spilling over as she reached across the space between them and took his hand, took it firmly, deliberately, refusing to let him retreat behind the walls she had spent months slowly dismantling. "You did not fail her," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "And you are not poison, Sebastian. You are a man who has carried guilt he never deserved, who built a fortress of solitude because he believed it was the only way to protect others from a danger that existed only in his grief-stricken imagination." She lifted his hand to her cheek, held it there against her skin, let him feel the warmth and the reality of her presence. "You have me now, if you want me, not the arrangement we agreed to, not the convenient wife who asks no questions, but me, truly, wholly, for whatever that is worth." And Sebastian stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, as though every moment of the past months had been leading to this single crystalline instant of recognition, and when he kissed her it was tentative at first, questioning, as though he expected her to vanish like mist at his touch, but she answered him with certainty, with the courage she had discovered in herself during their long journey together, and the kiss deepened into something consuming, something that spoke of winter ending and spring promised, of two wounded souls who had somehow found in each other not completion but companionship, not perfection but presence. And outside the carriage windows the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the harsh world in white and transforming the familiar streets into something new, something waiting to be written upon, something very like hope. Months later, when spring finally arrived at Thornfield with all its tender insistence, painting the grey landscape in shades of green and gold and the palest pink of apple blossoms, the transformation of the estate seemed to mirror something far more profound, the quiet revolution that had occurred within its walls, within the hearts of its master and mistress, within the very air that now carried the sound of laughter, where once there had been only the heavy silence of grief, too long held and love too long denied. Sebastian laughed now, not often, not easily, for he was still a man who had spent years forgetting how, but genuinely, unexpectedly, in moments that caught Rosalind by surprise and filled her with a joy so fierce it bordered on pain, when she made a particularly cutting observation about the latest society gossip, when she beat him at chess for the first time and crowed with unladylike triumph, when she stumbled over her hem in the garden and landed in an undignified heap among the roses she had spent months coaxing back to life. Mrs. Crane, who had served the Blackwood family for 3 decades and had weathered the storm of Eleanor's illness and death, the long frozen years of Sebastian's isolation, the whispered speculation of a staff who had wondered if their master would ever emerge from his self-imposed exile, now moved through the halls of Thornfield, with tears perpetually threatening at the corners of her eyes. Happy tears, she insisted, when Rosalind inquired after her health, merely the dust, Your Grace, merely the dust. But it was not dust that made the old housekeeper weep when she heard music drifting from the long-closed music room, where the Duchess had discovered a pianoforte, buried beneath Holland covers and years of neglect, or when she found the Duke standing in the restored garden at dawn, watching his wife cut flowers with an expression of such naked tenderness that it seemed almost indecent to witness. The staff marveled at it, all the curtains thrown wide to admit the spring sunshine, the vases of fresh flowers that appeared in every room, the dinner conversations that stretched for hours as husband and wife debated philosophy and politics, and the merits of various poets, with an intellectual ferocity that would have scandalized the ton, but which left them both flushed and bright-eyed with the pleasure of being truly matched. Their marriage was not perfect, they still clashed, still carried scars that would never fully heal, still had moments when old habits of distance and defense rose up between them like walls that had to be dismantled again and again, with patience and presence, and the hard-won knowledge that love was not a destination but a daily choice, a garden that required constant tending. But they had chosen each other authentically now, not from desperation or convenience, but from genuine recognition, and the garden Rosalind had rebuilt from ruin blazed with roses climbing every wall, red and white and pink and gold, a riot of color and fragrance that spilled over the ancient stones, like a visible testament to what could grow when someone was brave enough to stay, patient enough to nurture, willing enough to believe that even the most barren ground could bloom again, if only it was offered sunlight and care, and the steady, stubborn, transformative power of a love that refused to surrender to winter. The announcement appeared in the society pages on a morning when summer had reached its full glory, when the gardens of Thornfield blazed with color and the air hung heavy with the scent of roses, and it read simply that His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield, had made a substantial donation to establish a foundation for the support and education of impoverished gentlewomen, young ladies of good birth who, through no fault of their own, found themselves without resources or prospects, trapped in that particular purgatory, reserved for women who were too well bred to work and too poor to marry, invisible to a society that valued only what it could use, and the foundation would bear the name of Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield, in honor of her tireless advocacy for those whom the ton had chosen to overlook. The whispers that had followed Sebastian Blackwood for a decade began, slowly, to shift in timbre and tone, confusion replacing certainty, grudging respect emerging where fear had long held dominion. For here was the Devil Duke performing an act of such public generosity that even his most determined detractors found their narratives difficult to maintain, and when Rosalind read the announcement over breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the paper, she found Sebastian watching her with an expression that had become familiar over the past months, but which still had the power to steal her breath. Tenderness unguarded, love unashamed, the face of a man who had finally stopped hiding from the possibility of happiness. "You did not tell me," she said, and he rose from his chair to cross to her, to take her hands in his and raise them to his lips, with a reverence that would have seemed impossible from the cold stranger she had married in that sparse ceremony, what felt like lifetimes ago. "You taught me," he said quietly. "That reputation is nothing less than nothing beside the opinion of those who truly see us, that I had spent years building walls to protect myself from whispers that could never have wounded me as deeply as my own isolation, that the ton's judgment was a cage I had chosen to inhabit when the door had never been locked at all." And Rosalind felt tears prick at her eyes as she remembered the girl she had been, standing at the margins of ballrooms, perfecting the art of invisibility, because she had believed it was her only defense against a world that had deemed her worthless. "And you taught me," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm it, "that being invisible was never safety. It was surrender, a slow death of the spirit disguised as self-preservation, and that the bravest thing I could do was not to hide from those who might reject me, but to stand fully seen and trust that somewhere, somehow, there would be eyes capable of recognizing what others had overlooked." And Sebastian pulled her close, held her against his heart in the morning light that streamed through windows, no longer shrouded in perpetual gloom, and outside the open doors the garden she had rebuilt from ruin stretched in glorious abundance, a living testament to what could flourish when someone was brave enough to believe that even the most barren ground deserved the chance to bloom. 3 years later, on an afternoon when late summer had painted Thornfield in shades of amber and gold, and the roses that climbed every ancient wall had reached their final magnificent bloom before autumn's inevitable arrival, the estate that had once stood in melancholic isolation, a widow in mourning, the locals had whispered, a tomb for a living man, now rang with sounds that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known the Devil Duke in those dark years when he had walked his halls alone, with only his grief and guilt for company. The bright peal of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for so long. The music of small feet running across floors that servants now polished with pride rather than mere duty. the particular chaos that arrives when a house becomes not merely a dwelling, but a home in the truest and most profound sense of the word. Sebastian Blackwood, who had once made ballrooms fall silent with his entrance and sent debutantes fleeing with a single cold glance, now sat in the library that had witnessed his loneliest nights, the same library where Rosalind had first glimpsed the man behind the monster's mask, reading poetry to himself in the small hours when sleep refused to come, teaching his daughter the intricacies of chess with a patience that would have astonished anyone who remembered the ice-cold Duke of Legend, his scarred face softened by a smile that reached his eyes as the little girl with her mother's sharp wit and her father's dark curls frowned at the board with fierce concentration, demanding to know why the Queen was more powerful than the King and declaring it only sensible when he explained. In the garden that Rosalind had rebuilt from ruin, that glorious testament to what could flourish when someone refused to abandon even the most neglected ground, the Duchess herself sat reading beneath a canopy of climbing roses, one hand resting on the swell of her belly where a third child grew, while their son, barely 2 years old, toddled among the flowers with the watchful nursemaid trailing behind. And she looked up every few moments to watch her husband through the library window, still marveling after all this time that the man who had offered her a loveless arrangement had become the center of her entire world, that the frozen stranger had thawed into someone who kissed her each morning like she was a miracle he had never expected to deserve. The village that had once whispered about the Duke with fear now spoke of him with genuine affection, the families he had helped, the school he continued to fund, the way he had opened Thornfield's grounds for festivals and celebrations, the transformation that everyone attributed, rightly, to the quiet woman who had arrived as a stranger and seen what no one else had been brave enough to look for, and when old neighbors visited, when the vicar came for dinner, when the children of servants who had once feared their master now played with the Duke's own children without a trace of the old terror, it was clear that the devil Duke had become simply the Duke, imperfect and scarred, and carrying still the weight of a past that would never entirely release him, but happy, profoundly loved, and loving in return, with a devotion that had only deepened with each passing season. As evening approached and the children were gathered for supper, Sebastian found Rosalind still in the garden, and without words, for they had learned a language beyond speech. In these years of building a life together, he took her hand in his, and they watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that matched the roses around them, fingers intertwined, breathing in the fragrance of everything they had grown from the barren ground of two wounded hearts. And Rosalind thought that if she could go back and tell that invisible girl, standing at the margins of the Ashworth ball, what awaited her, that girl would never have believed that such happiness was possible, that such love existed, that she, of all people, might find it with the man all of London had warned her to fear. Dear listener, if you have journeyed with me through these pages, through the glittering cruelty of ballrooms and the quiet revolution of gardens reclaimed from ruin, through the slow thawing of frozen hearts and the patient work of two souls learning to see each other truly, then perhaps you have already understood what this story has been trying to say. That reputation is a cage others build around us, bar by bar, whisper by whisper, until we forget that we were never meant to be prisoners, that the locks exist only because we believe in them, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is to look at another person and refuse to see only what we have been told to see, to trust instead in the evidence of our own hearts. In the small moments that reveal what grand gestures never can, in the poetry read alone at midnight, and the secret kindnesses that expect no recognition, and the exhaustion behind eyes that the world has deemed too frightening to approach. Perhaps you have known what it is to be invisible, to stand at the margins, while the world celebrates those it has deemed worthy, to perfect the art of taking up no space, because you learned early that your presence was a burden others merely tolerated, and if you have, then I hope you will carry with you the truth that Rosalind discovered in that melancholic house full of shadows, that invisibility is not safety but surrender, a slow fading that masquerades as wisdom, and that the cure is not to shout louder, but simply to remain, to be present, to refuse to disappear even when disappearing would be easier. Perhaps you have known what it is to wear a mask so long that you have forgotten the face beneath it, to build walls so high that you can no longer remember what you were protecting, to choose loneliness because loss seemed too terrible to risk. And if you have, then I hope you will remember that Sebastian learned what all of us must eventually learn, that the heart, for all its fragility, was made to love, and that the deepest wounds heal not through isolation, but through the patient presence of someone brave enough to stay. Someone who sees the monster the world has made of you and looks deeper, always deeper, until they find the man who reads poetry in the dark and funds schools for children he will never meet and carries guilt for tragedies he could not have prevented. Love, the truest kind, is not the lightning strike of ballroom romance, but the slow and steady cultivation of a garden, the daily choice to tend what is struggling, to believe in blooms that have not yet appeared, to trust that even the most barren ground, given enough patience and presence and faith, can become something beautiful beyond imagining. So if tonight you find yourself standing at the margins, overlooked and undervalued, or if you find yourself behind walls of your own making, frozen in a loneliness you have convinced yourself is strength, I hope you will remember this story and find in it the courage to stay, to see, to be seen in return. May you find your own Thornfield, your own roses climbing ancient walls, your own hands to hold as the sun sets on everything you have built together. May you rest well, dear listener, and may you wake to discover that the person the world warned you about was only ever waiting for someone brave enough to look beneath the surface and recognize what had been there all along.